So for today, Chris, we've been reading sections 39 through 43, and I thought we might look at 42, where Whitman really talks about the voice that is creating the Song of Myself. And the nature of that voice, he says, a call in the midst of the crowd, my own voice, orotund, sweeping, and final. And in those two lines, we catch something of a key aspect of Whitman, that the voice is always sweeping and orotund and final and rising above the crowd, but also very much a part of it and speaking for it and echoing what he's hearing in the crowd. So he talks about the easily written, loose-fingered chords. I feel the thrum of your climax and close. And everything around him, as he says, my head slews round on my neck. And the catalogs we've talked about, everything seems to emerge from simply the head moving on the neck and looking around, and the ears picking up the sounds, which become musical, become the thrums, become music rolls, but not from the organ. It's rolls from all the sounds around him. And then he uses the interesting word toward the end of 42, he says, not words of routine, this song of mine. You know, the idea of how Whitman gets to that title, Song of Myself, in 1881. He's thought of it as a poem that he might call Leaves of Grass, like the whole book. He's thought of it as a poem of Walt Whitman. He's thought of it just as Walt Whitman. But eventually it becomes Song of Myself, and I've always been intrigued with that word song with Whitman, because I think he moves from poem to song, because for him, song it's that ancient Indo-European word that really doesn't change much from the Indo-European roots. It's incantation, it's words mixed with the movements of the body and the vocalization. It's muscular as well as linguistic.
It's not routine.
Not routine.
He is going to find a language that transcends the routine and becomes song.
That's right. That's right. So with this 1881 naming of Song of Myself, we get the title for the poem as we all know it now, but always important to remember that, like everything else in Whitman, it's undergone a series of changes, it's undergone a kind of evolution.
And as you have noted in other places, that we have really 6 separate versions of this Song of Myself, each pointing to significant moments in Whitman's life as well as in the life of the country.
Right, and yeah, it's probably worth reviewing once again what those 6 moments are. 1855, the first one in the middle of that tumultuous decade leading up to the Civil War. 1856, the year after it comes out, Whitman immediately beginning to embellish and expand and already rearrange poems.
Already revising himself.
Revising himself, putting titles on every poem. And then the 1860 edition, the 3rd edition to come out before the Civil War, but this one right on the edge of the Civil War. In fact, Whitman, on the title page, has the edition hyphenated, the date is hyphenated, 1860-61. So we get, you know, it's almost as if Whitman can feel it happening, that break, that division between the last year of peace, the first year of war.
The election of Lincoln and his inauguration.
Right, and then we get the 1867 edition, where Whitman's not sure after the war that Leaves of Grass as it existed before the war has any relevance to the completely torn apart and now reconstructing country, but then decides that everything he had spoken about in terms of union was now more necessary than ever. And that's when he begins to suture in those Drum Taps poems, the poems that he wrote during the Civil War, and begin to see them as part of Leaves of Grass and Forever Changing Leaves of Grass. And then that would develop more in the 1870 edition, where he comes up with a whole new set of clusters, and then 1881, where he completely revises the book. Drum Tap's poems now get, the Civil War poems get scattered out through the book, almost as if you can feel the bloodshed of the Civil War seeping into every aspect of the war. And he goes back to poems like This Compost and puts in a half line that brings the war to your mind as you're thinking of the composting. He talks about the lilacs blooming in the dooryard, and immediately now when you read This Compost, you begin thinking of his great elegy to Lincoln. So everything in Whitman is evolutional and episodical. There are episodes of Leaves of Grass, but there's also a kind of evolution, and Song of Myself undergoes an evolution from 1855 to 1881.
There's a way in which he's writing himself into this Song of Myself, and that was the theme of our conversation last summer.
Whitman revises lines, titles, whole poems, endlessly rewriting himself, if you will, over the course of his life. Song of Myself begins as Leaves of Grass, then it becomes the poem of Walt Whitman, an American, then just Walt Whitman, and finally in 1881 he decides to title it Song of Myself. What do you make of these kinds of changes, this deepening of perspective, if you will, about what his project is?
Yeah, it's really what makes Whitman Whitman, that incessant self-revision, that incessant changing of everything having to do with the book Leaves of Grass. And as we track it over his lifetime, it really becomes all the more fascinating, because he initially, when he is writing his poems, conceiving of these poems, he conceives of the lines as individual units that can be moved around, and lots of Whitman manuscripts are literally cut and pasted, where he'll have a poem in a sequence of lines that he then cuts them up and shifts them around until he finds an order that he likes. But the lines themselves are these individual units. As he ages, a lot of critics over the years have felt that Whitman's poems in the last couple of decades of his life decline in quality. But what fascinates me is that he never stops this incessant revision, this shifting around. At the beginning it was the shifting around of lines. Toward the end of his life it was the shifting around of poems, so that every edition of Leaves of Grass has a different ordering of the poems. And what he used to be doing with the lines, cutting and pasting them in different orders to see what happened when these particular units were in a different juxtaposition with each other, he starts doing the same thing with his poems, the poems themselves. So a poem like This Compost feels very different when you put it after Song of Myself or before Song of Myself. What poems surround it, what poems are speaking to it. He keeps creating these different clusters of poems and renaming these clusters. Everything is renaming. Audrey and Rich used to talk about how poetry itself is renaming, and I always think of Whitman when I hear that comment, because for Whitman, Song of Myself and all of Leaves of Grass was a continual act of renaming. Song of Myself, when he begins it with that repeated title. For a long time, people looking at the 1855 Leaves of Grass at the opening poem just believed it was an untitled poem, but in fact right in the place of the title is the repeated title of the book, Leaves of Grass, as if every one of the poems was another leaf in this sort of variegated ground of grass that is growing up out of his imagination. And then he begins to play with the idea of this this figure, Walt Whitman, that shares the same name with the Walt Whitman, the historical Walt Whitman, but this Walt Whitman now in the poem becomes the as Borges called him, the mythical figure.
Everyman.
The everyman figure, yeah. And I think that over the years, Whitman got frustrated with the way people responded to Song of Myself when he was calling it Walt Whitman, or when he was calling it the poem of Walt Whitman, an American. Friends and other acquaintances would read it biographically. They would read it as, oh, well, this is just Whitman writing a biographical poem about himself. And I think ultimately Whitman decided on that much more distanced title, Song of Myself, as suggesting something about the idea that this epic character that he was looking at was really the I itself. It was the eye of the reader as well as the eye of the writer. And
there's such a sense of design through the entire career that this is one long poem that he's creating in Leaves of Grass, and he's renaming the world. As the years go on, how do you imagine what that renaming means? What's that deeper design that he seems to be getting at? I know critics have said there's a lessening of power as the years go on, but by the way you're talking about it, it sounds as if no, he's renaming he's renaming the world anew in ways that have to do with all the experience he's accumulated over the course of a long life.
Yeah, I think that's right, and he certainly, in his own mind, at least by the end of his life, believed that that final deathbed edition, that final arrangement of Leaves of Grass was the arrangement that he was most happy with, that he had been moving toward. My own sense, though, is that each of those 6 editions of Leaves of Grass, very different editions, each one I think of as a separate book, that each one was responding to a biographical moment, to a cultural moment, to a political moment. Each one had to be arranged differently because he was a different person at that point. I always think of Whitman's love of photography and how Whitman really was of the first generation of humans who ever saw himself age over a lifetime by being able to look back to photographs.
And so a book can encompass that.
A book can encompass it, and that sort of flip book we're all used to having now, of seeing ourselves as kids growing up to the point we are now, and we can just flip through that little sequence of photographic images. It's interesting to think of what it was like for Whitman, who was really of the first generation, one of the most photographed people of his generation, certainly the most photographed writer. And he had images of himself from his 20s up to his 70s, and as he looked at those with friends, he would say, you know, when I look at these images, I wonder if what I'm looking at is episodical or evolutional. You know, whether I'm seeing episodes of different Walt Whitmans, or whether I'm seeing the evolution of a single Walt Whitman. And I think for Leaves of Grass, it was exactly the same situation. By the end of his life, there were times when he'd look at that book and he'd think, it really is 6 different books. It's 6 different episodes in Walt Whitman's life. And then there were other times he looked at it and he said, no, I can see it's all been evolving toward this. Because I think we all have that sense that both those things are true. We look at ourselves 20 years ago, 30 years ago in a photograph, and we think, yeah, that was me, but in another way, that was a very different person.
So that it becomes as much an account as a palimpsest of the different selves.
Yeah, an account, exactly. And I really think of those 6 books. If we could get our grip around why he arranged those books in those particular ways.
At that moment.
At that moment, we would get right at that political, historical, cultural, biographical nexus that formed this particular arrangement of Leaves of Grass.
That's really interesting because it makes me think of the just a little thing I read in a biography of the great French Nobel laureate Saint-Jean Paris, who loved Whitman. And it said in his final month, he spent his final months rearranging the poems in his last book. And it's only 4 poems. And I've often thought, he's rearranging those 4 poems, he's spending months on it. And then, as you're saying this, I realized, well, he's got to get it right.
Right.